Chapter 5. Our Puritan ancestors took it as an article of faith that the idle were unworthy of charity, a sentiment famously captured by the Calvinist preacher Cotton Mather. For those who indulge themselves in idleness, the express command of God unto us is that we should let them starve. Long after a mayor departed this world, his spirit lived on, embodied in the nation's poor laws, statutes that outlined the government's responsibility to the destitute. The poor laws combined guarded concern for needy Americans with suspicions that they were complicit in their own misfortune. Under the poor laws, the chronically jobless were removed from the society and dispatched to country poorhouses, cash call institutions that were also home to the old, infirm, and mentally ill. Those who could ordinarily shift for themselves but were temporarily jobless applied to public officials, men with no special welfare training, for what was known as outdoor or home relief assistance, generally given in form of food and coal. To discourage idlers, the welfare experience was made as unpleasant as possible. Before applying for help, the poor were made to wait until utterly penniless and then declare it publicly. When granting relief, officers followed the old rule of thumb that families living on the town must never reach the comfort level of the poorest independent family. The weekly food allowance was a meager $4 a week, and less in some areas, regardless of how many people it was supposed to feed. Finally, it was customary to give food and coal on alternate weeks, providing minimal nourishment and warmth, but never food at the same time. The custom and by law, public relief in the United States had always been a local concern, the responsibility of towns, cities, and counties. By the summer of 1931, however, in communities across the United States, the money raised for the jobless had evaporated, while the numbers of people applying for it continued to climb. Still, Hoover remained confident that between the private charity and the local government, America would find its way out of the job crisis. An announcement for the White House in August made it official. The president was against the federal dole and was not about to support one, and Albany Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt took the news at his cue, and on August 29, 1931, he proposed the creation of the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, the state program for the helping the unemployed dramatically expanded the government to care for its people. In times of crisis, Roosevelt argued the government was obliged to help the victims of adverse circumstances, providing them with shelter, clothing, and food, not as a matter of charity, but as a matter of social duty. When terror was passed into law in September, for the first time in the country's history, a state government assumed the job for feeding the hungry. In the months of deliberation leading up to terror, social workers became Roosevelt's eyes and ears. The government consulted with social worker Homer Folks, the author of two major reports on living conditions around the state, and press news about the necessity of taking action. Formulating his plans of emergency, Roosevelt looked to social workers for guidance, and when it was time to staff his administration, he chose social worker Harry Hopkins for the job of director. 42 years old at the time, Hopkins was a gangly chain smoker and a drinker of black coffee habits that accentuated his own natural stores of nervous energy. On his first job with the settlement house, he had channeled that energy into his career, climbing job by job from fields worker to director of the New York Tuberculosis Association. During terror would require some of his professional experience as terror was conceived as a kind of task force. The original staff of 50, many of them social workers and more than half volunteers, set up a command center in Manhattan, East 28th Street, with the idea that it would operate from November to June. Though the centers was brief, the organizers were impressed by the magnitude of their endeavor. In the minds of the creators, terror marked the arrival of the welfare system that was rational and efficient, but also compassionate. And the centerpiece was the public works program through which jobless men and women could earn an honest wage, which was always preferable to handouts, but the administration's first objective was preventing starvation. Harry Hopkins, also known as the Minister of Relief, Harrison Ewing Collection, Library of Congress, LCDIG, EGC, 21642. Food relief under terror was one front in the welfare revolution. Its manifesto, a 30-page manual issued by the new administration and distributed to officials across the state. Where public welfare traditionally observed a one-size-fits-all policy, food relief under terror was rationalized, each distribution calculated to feed households of different size and composition. Under the old welfare regime, humiliation was brandished like a stick. Terror inspired to more considerate methods. The application process began with the interview at the local welfare office conducted behind closed doors to preserve privacy. Since the person doing the interviewing was a member of the old public welfare regime, he was supervised by a terror social worker, thus ensuring the policy a kindly consideration to avoid public lines and similar spectacles. Qualified households received weekly grocery orders, which, like coupons, could be discreetly traded in for food at the local market. Finally, in distinction to the premeditated stinginess of the past, food relief under the new administration had to be adequate. In early Terra planning sessions, the question was raised of whether adequate relief, defined by Terra as sufficient to prevent physical suffering and maintain minimal living standards, would remove the incentive to work. The answer was yes, but only if the Depression dragged on for years, which was inconceivable. The Depression's many emergency diets, including the one issued by Terra, belong to this history of nutritional guidance for the poor that began with Atwater at the turn of the century. To help ensure a productive workforce, in 1994, Atwater established America's first dietary standards, nutritional recommendations directed at the nation's wage earners that were based on levels of physical exertion. So, for example, a watchman required more nutrients than a clerk, but fewer than a carpenter, each man consuming only the food required to perform his daily labors. Using the man of the family as his reference point, Atwater then calculated the food needs of women and children, a bizarrely illogical formula. Should the family of a tailor receive half as much as nourishment as that of a street paver? Over the next few decades, the standards were widely adopted by hospitals, schools, and other institutions. They were also embraced by private charities, which used them as a basis for food relief, bringing Atwater into the home. In 1917, the year America entered World War I, the nation received some unsettling health news. According to the Draft Bureau, the millions of men called to serve, young men in their supposed prime, more than a third were physically unfit for combat. Many were conditions caused by poor diet, like rickets and bad teeth. The start of the food conversation later that year unleashed a new round of nutritional worries. The sharp rise in food prices caused a conversation that had set off a corresponding increase in childhood malnutrition. The hardest hit were poor families living in cities like New York, where the Board of Health inspectors reported that one-eighth of the city's schoolchildren were underfed. As food authorities shifted their attention for the work of the child, health agencies opened free nutrition clinics, mounted food exhibitions, and issued instructional leaflets. Newspapers printed special children's menus recipes that were both conservation-minded and nutritious, all part of the sweeping educational campaign directed at American homemakers. I feel like I've already read this part out loud. I'm confused by that. Lucy Gillette was a New York nutritionist who worked for one of the city's oldest and largest charities, the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor. In 1917, just as childhood malnutrition was grappling newspaper headlines, Gillette was finishing her own study on the subject. Among her conclusions was the fact that children fed on Atwater's standards were suffering the consequences, kept alive in a state semi-starvation. In place of Atwater's fractions, Gillette proposed that the nutritionist treat each family member on his or her own merits, according to that person's age, size, and level of activity. Gillette's 1918 Food Primer for the Home, one of the many nutrition manuals published during the war, stressed the importance of ample feeding, assuring mothers there was little danger of eating too much balanced diet. Good nutrition, moreover, was within the grasp of rich and poor alike and easy to achieve as following these basic guidelines. Spend no more for meat than for milk. Spend as much or more for vegetables and fruit as for meat. Eat freely of cereals and bread to satisfy the appetite. Though nutritionists and welfare workers shared overlapping concerns, Gillette was an early example of someone who combined them in one job. On her retirement in 1944, she was described as the first nutritionist to work in the welfare field. At the intersection of these two emerging professions, she could appreciate the importance of balancing economy on the one hand with the nutritional requirements for good health on the other. Her compromise was the adequate minimum food allowance, a weekly grocery order below which health was at risk. Gillette worked out a method for arriving at that dollar amount, which would of course vary from family to family and region to region, allowing charities to dispense food dollars with scientific precision and efficiency. While the country tended to nutrition problems at home, the more pressing food crisis was unfolding thousands of miles away in war-torn Europe. Under Herbert Hoover's leadership, the United States Food Administration responded with a relief program of dishes enough to feed a continent. Americans were encouraged to curtail their consumption of beef, pork, wheat, butter, and sugar, while the government fed Allied troops of millions of refugees in Europe. In the first years of the Great Depression, with the war still alive in people's memories, the nation experienced a sense of deja vu. Another food emergency was at hand, only this time the hungry masses were here on American soil. In a replay of 1917, nutritionists and other food authorities jumped in with a device. Newspapers began to print suggestions for budget menus, recommending the temporary suspension of America's normal eating habits. Most dramatically, families accustomed to 2 meat meals a day would have to cut back only 3 or 4 a week, presenting a creative challenge to the home cook. Satisfying the family with a standing roast was easy. But how would the home cook do the same with lima beans? To this question, the authorities had a ready answer. The fact that a really good cook can serve better meals on a small budget than a poor cook can serve on the fat of the land suggests that the fault may not be in the food material itself, but in the manner in which the food is prepared and served, and therein lies the tale. So the gauntlet was thrown. Columnists who wrote for the women's pages exhorted home cooks to raise the level of their game and master new skills. To imbue these beans with savor, women would learn to cook them with a piece of beef fat saved for the night before. Soup making, which required only bones, was an essential skill, and for those occasions when meat was available, homemakers would then have to brush up on braising and stewing, cooking methods that best suited the cheapest parts of the animal, but more enticing than their soups was cooking en casserole. A food column favorite, casserole cookery was well suited to inexpensive ingredients. It was easy to serve and clean up after, and like one-pot meals, a casserole saved on fuel costs. Best of all was its endless flexibility, inviting women to experiment with whatever was on hand. A story on casserole cooking in the New York Herald Tribune hinted at all the possibilities. Lima beans, onions, green peppers, and tomatoes en casserole, Spanish rice, stuffed eggplant, vegetable loaf or vegetable pies, baked peas and bacon, rice baked with cheese and tomatoes, corned beef hash au gratin, baked liver with vegetables and macaroni, scalloped salmon, stuffed onions and stuffed peppers, tomatoes and lima beans en casserole, scalloped cauliflower, sweet potatoes and apples, tuna fish pie, stuffed beet heart, baked eggs au gratin, casserole of cheese and vegetables, Swiss steak with brown potatoes, cheese fondue, beef pie with pastry crust, lamb cutlets en casserole, shrimp creole, liver with spaghetti, baked dried fruit, baked meatballs with tomato sauce, baked beans with corn, baked onion soup. Finally, the casserole dish was a place to hide foods people did not especially like. One of them was liver and other beans, two of the more common casserole ingredients, and if the family groaned at the sight of leftovers, casseroles allowed budgeteers to bury yesterday's dinner now minced and coated with white sauce under a veil of breadcrumbs. Casseroles were one of the Depression's many mystery foods, inventions of necessity, which the cooking columns presented as feasts of ingenuity. Hence the following snippet of imagined dinner-time conversation from Mary Mead, food columnist at the Chicago Daily Tribune. "What is it?" demands father. "Guess," challenges mother. "Hash," ventures Billy. "Pie," gurgles Mary. But whatever the answer, it's bound to be an epic if mother is up to the minute on the art of turning homely foods into a culinary triumphs. Along the same mysterious lines, but more so, just about any food could be ground up, mixed with breadcrumbs and egg, and then shaped into a loaf and baked until firm. Women's pages were flooded with loaf recipes that used beans, liver, and nuts, cheap and generally unloved forms of protein, as stand-ins for beef, pork, and chicken. It was clearly a budget food, but in the interest of public morale, Med found reasons to sing its praises. All this new economizing, she wrote, had opened a grand and glorious field for adventure in creating new tantalizing dishes in which the old faithfuls can take on new charms. It would be hard to describe the need for food budgeting in a sunnier light. The following is her recipe for pea roast. 1 egg, well beaten, 1 tablespoon sugar, 1/4 cup melted butter, 1/2 cup pea pulp, canned or dried, 1/4 cup finely chopped peanuts, 3/4 cup whole milk, 3/4 cup stale breadcrumbs, salt and pepper to taste. Blend the melted butter with the sugar and eggs. Mix together the pea pulp, peanuts, seasonings, breadcrumbs, and milk and combine the first mixture. Turn into a greased pan and bake in a moderate oven, 350 degrees Fahrenheit, for 25 minutes. Serve with tomato sauce and a chopped pickle. This interesting entree comes to you for the pleasant sum of approximately 17 cents and serves for generously. Whatever invention took place in the kitchen was dependent on the women's shopping acumen. Articles on smart marketing employed homemakers to think of themselves as businesswomen and keep grocery accounts, a good way to identify wasteful spending patterns and root them out. But the key to staying on budget was planning menus in advance week by week with no spur-of-the-moment purchases and concessions to gastronomic whim. By the fall of 1930, The New York newspapers had begun to print these budget menus showing homemakers that it was possible, for example, to feed the family of $12 a week. New budgets appeared every few weeks, each one lower than the one preceding it, demanding greater and greater marketing discipline. Business girls living on their own to exercise similar restraint at the neighborhood cafeteria where so many of their meals were taken. In the winter of 1931, the YWCA put together a meal plan for the $1-a-day girl that would provide her with 2,000 calories daily, the lowest possible number consistent with good health and spirits. The following is a sample menu that published in New York newspapers on local cafeteria offerings. Breakfast: baked apple with cream, 2 slices toast with butter, coffee, cream, sugar. Lunch: cream soup, peanut and cheese salad, or toasted cheese sandwich, banana. Dinner: potatoes, gravy, coleslaw, mayonnaise, custard or pudding, milk. More restrained still for those on microscopic budgets, nutritionists designed 50-cent-a-day menus in which flavor satisfaction was taken out of the question. Intended mainly for students, the 50-cent meal plan, though spare, had everything essential for health and strength. Taking into account the different dietary needs of men and women, nutritionists offered a version for each gender. Breakfast in room, man: 1 pint of milk, 1/4 loaf whole wheat bread sliced, 1 banana, possibly 2. Woman: 1 pint milk, 1 shredded wheat biscuit, 1 orange, 1 teaspoon sugar. Lunch and cafeteria, man: choose milk in preference to coffee, cream soup, not thin, vegetables or salad always take butter. Woman: same as man's. Supper in room, man: 1 pint milk, rest of the day's milk, 1/4 pound graham crackers, 1 package of raisins. Woman: 1 pint milk flavored with chocolate syrup. Can be bought at 5 and 10-cent store for 10 cents. 1/4 loaf white bread, 1 banana, possibly 2. Food authorities understood that such Spartan offerings delivered minimal eating pleasure, but were confident that students would adjust to them quickly and in fact would come to feel better on them than on more expensive fare. Under more normal circumstances, a homemaker could rely on taste and habit when preparing meals, and chances are the family would be relatively well nourished. Under economic pressure, however, the same woman faced less promising odds. A deeper understanding of food science was one way to improve those odds. Families who are not familiar with food values, the experts warned, are practicing deadly sort of economy. The grocery bill must be trimmed but intelligently accomplished with a firm command of basic nutrition. Starting in 1931, a cascade of nutrition pamphlets, leaflets, and booklets began raining down on the American reading public. Available through schools, health departments, charities, and even the American Legion, they advised people to satisfy what nutritionists call the hidden hunger. Here again, ordinary men and women would have to find within themselves the self-discipline of an ascetic, ignore the pages in their bullets and their bellies in deference to the body's undetected need for minerals and vitamins. After all, hunger pain was temporary, and so was hunger-induced weakness, a shortage of essential nutrients. On the other hand, opened the door to lasting injury, problematic for anyone but disastrous for children who only grow but once. Many of these pamphlets came straight from the USDA's Bureau of Home Economics, the official government voice on all matters culinary. More were issued by private charities, but all relied on the same rule of thumb first devised by Lucy Gillette's teacher and mentor, Henry Sherman, professor of chemistry at Columbia University, where Gillette had studied. According to Sherman, the food budget ideally should be divided into fifths: 1 for fruits and vegetables, 1 for milk, 1 for meat, 1 for cereals, and the last for fats. In 1931, scrambling to put a staff together, Harry Hopkins naturally turned to people he knew from the social work community. Among them was Gillette, perhaps the one person in America best qualified to design the Terra diet. In the first month, Terra fed more than 38,000 New York families, but that number would rise, reaching a peak of 435,000 in 1935. The Terra diet, which gave the first priority to the needs of children, followed the 1/5 formula, concentrating on foods high in calcium and vitamins A, B, and C. Accordingly, potatoes, cabbage, carrots, canned tomatoes, dried beans, dried fruit, all vitamin-packed and cheap, made up the top tier of the Terra food hierarchy. At the pinnacle, however, milk was revered as the one food that contained all four of the protective nutrients, and the only food in which there was no substitute. An elixir of health, milk was indispensable to children, for whom Tara allowed it a quart a day, but was mandatory for adults as well who could get by with only a pint. The Depression's many emergency diets, including the one issued by Tara, were founded on repetition, real times restricted to a select group of bargain foods. The inevitable result was boredom, a fact of life accepted by food scientists who warned against the enticement of variety. Let no one be misled by the extravagant phrase deadly monotony, was Professor Sherman's advice. No deaths are ever caused by a monotony of diet, if the diet, however simple and cheap, provides the actual necessary nutrients. At least this was the view from on high. Closer to ground level, where real women faced the daily challenge of feeding their family, monotony was something to rally against. For homemakers daunted by the task of cooking with the same few ingredients week in and week out, inspiration was provided by a team of home economists at Cornell University. Formed in 1908, the Cornell Department of Home Economics was under the dual command of Martha Van Rensselaer and Flora Rose, who not only worked together but lived together as lifelong companions, sometimes referred to as Miss Van Rose. Both women belonged to the world of reformers and activists that included Eleanor Roosevelt. In fact, Rose and Roosevelt had met in the early 1920s through the League of Women Voters. The first encounter the start of an enduring friendship. The Van Roses were frequent house guests at the Roosevelt estate in Hyde Park, and the Roosevelts made yearly pilgrimages to Cornell to speak at its farm and home week. With the start of state-sponsored food relief in 1931, Rose and Van Rensselaer collaborated with Tara, creating relief menus that used only Tara-sanctioned foods, combined and recombined to give the illusion of variety. So from her 18-pound ration of potatoes, a woman might prepare potato and onion soup for one day, followed by potato omelet, potato hot pot, or scalloped potatoes baked in tomato sauce. The same tomato sauce was poured over deviled eggs, while whole onions were baked in it and eaten for lunch. Tomatoes were also scalloped on their own, the liquid from the can saved and served to the children at breakfast in place of orange juice. The typical Tara family, consisting of husband, wife, and 3 or 4 children, received 28 quarts of milk each week, some for the children to drink, the rest intended to use in cooking. With so much of it on hand, milk made a regular appearance in the Cornell recipes, poured into chowders and puddings, baked into breads, and stirred into white sauce. One of the true workhorses of the American kitchen. A better food of the domestic science movement, white sauce rose to culinary stardom at the tail end of the 19th century. The many stacks of cookbooks produced by home economists, Fanny Farmer's among them, all contained white sauce recipes, and every cooking school curriculum devoted a lesson to it. While the standard white sauce was made from 2 tablespoons of flour, 2 tablespoons of butter, and 1 cup of milk, it could be thinned or thickened according to use, concealing otherwise naked foods under an ivory cloak. It was poured over vegetables, cold meats, seafood, eggs, and macaroni, elevating ordinary ingredients and tempting flavors that were too pronounced on their own. It was the cream in the creamed chicken, creamed cod, creamed sweetbreads, and creamed tongue on toast. More discreetly, white sauce was thickened soups, enriched purees was the binding agent, and croquettes and the liquid component of anything scalloped. Cornell's Flora Rose and Martha Van Rensselaer. While visiting the Roosevelts in Hyde Park, Cornell University, Carl A. Kroc Library, Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections. During the Depression, home economists like Flora Rose turned to white sauce as a medium for pumping nutrients into the American diet. Devising ways to use it, Rose had an immense oeuvre of recipes to choose from. Creamed carrots was an old standard. In this recipe, carrots, white sauce, and pasta, an inexpensive source of energy, are combined into an odd but nourishing casserole. Creamed spaghetti with carrots. 1½ cups broken spaghetti, 3 tablespoons margarine, 3 tablespoons flour, 1/2 teaspoon salt, 1/8 teaspoon pepper, 3 cups fresh or diluted evaporated milk, 1½ cups cooked carrots. Clean and scrape carrots, cut in long narrow slices, and cook until tender and a small amount of boiling salted water. Cook the spaghetti until tender, about 25 minutes, in 3 quarts of boiled water, to which has been added 1½ tablespoons of salt. Drain. Melt fat, add flour and seasonings, and blend thoroughly. Pour on the milk and stir until thick and smooth. Cook for 5 minutes longer. Put 1/2 the spaghetti in a baking dish, cover with 1/2 carrots, then add 1/2 the sauce. Repeat using the remaining ingredients. Bake in a moderate oven for 15 to 20 minutes. As it turned out, plans for temporary relief in New York were prematurely optimistic. Intended to run through the spring of 1932, by March of that year, it was clear that Terra would have to extend. But where the economic news was glum, the mood among Terra directors was congratulatory. In a progress report to the governor, Harry Hopkins called Terra one of the greatest social experiments ever undertaken. Many doles had been tried before, he continued, but this was the first to sustain a great commonwealth without a tinge of beggary, feeding a hungry public while sparing it humiliation. The official view, however, was at odds with the experiences of those New Yorkers on the Terra relief rolls. For a family to qualify for Terra, all of its assets had to be exhausted, a slow process of attrition that stopped only when there was nothing left to sell and no one left to borrow from. To ascertain that applicants were truly destitute, officials subjected them to a round of interviews. Candor was not assumed. Rather, all claims were verified through interviews with relatives and former employers, which was not only embarrassing but could hurt a man's chances for employment in the future. More demanding, however, were the home visits by Terra investigators to make sure the family's situation was sufficiently desperate. Investigators came once a month, unannounced, anxious to catch welfare abusers. Any sign that the family's finances had improved, a suspiciously new-looking dress, or fresh set of window curtains was grounds for cross-examination. If the man of the house was not at home, a suggestion that he might be out earning money, investigators asked for his whereabouts, collecting names and addresses for later verification. Finally, though instructed otherwise, investigators were known to reprimand women for becoming pregnant while on relief, the ultimate intrusion. Families lived in dread of these monthly visits, terrified that they would be cut off if it was discovered that one of the kids had a paper route or some similar infraction. For all the earlier talk of revolution, home relief under Terra was surprisingly similar to old-style public welfare, which is not to say that Terra organizers were insincere. Rather, the failure to match actions with words allowed stubbornness of old convictions. Home relief was found on the premise that, given the opportunity, even productive men and women would surrender to temptation and settle into a life on the dole. Hopkins himself thought it would undermine the work ethic, convinced that if a man keeps beating a path to the welfare office to get a grocery order, he will gradually learn the way and it will be pretty hard to get him off that path. Individuals were at risk, but if the will to work was compromised on a large enough scale, so is the future of the country. Such were the corrupting powers of charity. With so much at stake, Terra officials felt beholden to monitor their welfare clients, protecting both the American work ethic and the public treasury. People receiving home relief, meanwhile, bristled at the supervision that reached into every room of the house, but was most pronounced in the kitchen. Terra's decision to give help in kind was meant to diminish the appearance of a traditional money-based dole. However, it helped control what the Terra clients were eating. In some areas, including New York City, pantry snoopers accompanied women to the market to confirm that all parties, both shoppers and shopkeeper, were complying with Terra's marketing guidelines. More prying took place in the kitchen itself, where investigators lifted pot covers and peered into ice boxes on the lookout for dietary violations. As resentment smoldered, social workers began to question the wisdom of so much government meddling. A very public critique that ran in the New York Times sized up the dangers. "By our grocery ticket dole," it began, "our bags of coal, our bundles of clothing, our rent vouchers, we have taken from people the right to manage their own lives. The result of giving help in kind was more humiliation, people shamed into thinking they were incapable of doing the job on their own. Though no member of the family was completely safe from the long arms of Terra. Supervision in all matters culinary was aimed directly at homemakers. Told what to cook, they were also told where to shop. With their food tickets good only at Terra-appointed stores, women were effectively barred from their corner grocers and sent on treks to unfamiliar merchants. Veteran homemakers, women who knew where their bargains were, not only resented the intrusion, but were sure they could squeeze more out of their relief allowances by shopping stores of their own choosing. By 1934, Hopkins, too, was having doubts about the Terra's role as the dietary watchdog, unsure of which was more damaging, a lack of vitamins or complete surrender of choice. He abandoned the idea of grocery orders, replacing them with cash. If work was the best kind of help a person could receive, money was second, a lesson he carried to his next job as director of the Federal Relief under the President Roosevelt. 2 years into Terra, New Yorkers were still languishing on food allowances that were far short of adequate. One reason was the opposition put up by local welfare officials, the people in charge of putting those allowances into practice. Though created by the state, Terra was in fact a partnership between state and local governments, the first dependent on the second for cooperation. Early on, Hopkins had chosen not to enforce Terra's welfare standards, adopting a policy of education and persuasion. The money to pay for Terra, likewise, came from both state and town treasuries, the price tag more or less split between them. Welfare officers in many of those towns proved unpersuadable, comfortable with the old standards. Officials with decades on the job that a $4 food allowance had always been good enough and saw no compelling reason to raise it. And food allowances had always been good enough and saw no compelling reason. Oh my gosh. In rural districts, officers mistakenly assumed that farm families could provide their own eggs, chicken, fruit, and vegetables and trim budgets based on food that did not exist. Others argue that local living standards had always been low and that it was wrong for Terra clients to be dining on foods that the officers themselves could not afford. Then again, cooperation was not always a matter of choice. On the contrary, even with help from the state, adequate food relief was beyond the means of many communities, making compliance impossible. Powerless to do otherwise, officials who accepted the new standards were obliged to cut budgets already at minimum levels. Reports of slow starvation began flittering into Terra headquarters. The amount allowed for food is inadequate for all families, one of them stated. In addition to insufficient milk, there is no family which has had a significant amount of vegetables, either fresh or canned, including tomatoes, leafy or root vegetables. Vegetables which may be eaten raw were used only in a very few families in very small amounts. There are few families which have had a sufficient amount of potatoes. There is no family which has had a sufficient amount of fruit, and few families which have had any fried fruit. There is no family which has used sufficient amount of dark cooked or breakfast cereals or dark bread. There is no family which has not used some eggs, but few families have had a sufficient number. Of the 30 family studies, the only food eaten in relative abundance was macaroni and cooking oil. Accelerated by the newness of what they were attempting, Hopkins and their top people shared an energizing esprit de corps. But novelty had drawbacks too, having no precedents to lean on and no established relief standards to refer to. When Terra had money for rent or to pay doctors' bills, it was forced to rely on educated guesswork. With so many people dependent on Terra, the vagueness about how much to give was part of the job that rattled Hopkins. On the front, however, Terra could proceed with confidence. Food standards, unlike any other budget item, were scientifically determined, backed up by principles that never changed that applied to everyone. However, not even science could amount for all the variables that people introduced into the equation. Among them was the willingness of tens of thousands of women to follow the standards. A home cook who had never heard of calories or vitamins, who was reluctant to take advice from strangers, and government strangers no less, required more than a pamphlet from the welfare office to accept the new food science. That it went against women's inclinations only added to their doubts. If the baby crying for food, would a plate of cabbage stop her tears? In place of cabbage and carrots, women invested in pasta, rice, and bread, foods that satisfied an immediate need but left the children malnourished. To better educate these women and help close the nutrition deficit, home economists from around the state organized nutrition and cooking classes, staged cooking demonstrations, and went door to door as visiting housekeepers, dispensing on-the-spot advice. In collaboration with local welfare offices, home economists like Rose and Van Rensselaer worked as messengers, interpreting the government's advice and presenting it in practical terms women could appreciate. Where the Terra investigator was someone to be feared, visiting housekeepers were received as allies. Women once resistant to the gospel preached by the home economists signed up for nutrition classes, anxious to know why their children were listless and pale. They attended lectures on wise food buying at the local church and formed neighborhood cooking classes. On leaving the welfare office, they picked up mimeographed recipes like the ones prepared by Cornell, read the department's nutrition bulletins, and sent letters asking for information on topics ranging from the mechanics of digestion to the methods of food preservation. The letter from the homemaker wondering about healthy ways to combine foods hints at the newly awakened desire for food knowledge. I am very interested in nutrition. I do not understand calories or vitamins, just what they are. I understand what foods change when taken into the stomach, but I want to know is this: what foods go together? What is the difference in the stomach if coffee is mixed with milk before drinking, or a cup of black coffee and a glass of milk taken separately? I have 7 children at home, and I am continually studying what to feed them for the best results. Milk, I understand, is the best food, but does it not sometimes change to a harmful food when certain conditions of the stomach? There is so much I do not understand. For home economists, an opportunity presented itself. Women who thought their profession as a calling, who believed in the revolutionary possibilities of home economics, but until now had reached only a modest audience, saw their stock rising. The public was ready to learn, and home economists would take full advantage of a story that had already begun to play out on a national scale. We have 5 chapters left, so we're actually I I'm not actually sure if I would say like halfway through, like close to halfway through. Hmm. I think it would be a good idea to drink some water before I continue. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. Oh, I'm sorry. I'll be right back. got some water and a spinach sandwich with olive oil. This is what it looks like. I wanted the spinach to be kind of like cooked spinach, so I microwaved it a little bit with olive oil. Hmm. If it sounds like a fish tank, it's probably my computer overheating. It's just doing it, I don't know why. There we go. It's just I know this is kind of messy and it's like better to not show eating it. You know, because spinach is green. And when it cooks, it just is messy looking. I'll turn to Popeye. I really wanted spinach. I've been wanting ice and spinach. Um, I kind of want tomato juice too. Tomato juice and like a slushy, but I'd be fine if it were just like water, a water slushy, unflavored slushy. That would be fine with me right now. Honestly, I don't know why. Like, it's not that it's hot because it really isn't. It's not. It's not over cold right now either. It's just yeah. Yeah, I was hungry. Yeah, reading about the carrot spaghetti is bound to make me hungry. But also thirsty. I mean, sometimes it's a good idea after a chapter to drink water. Yeah, I feel better. I feel better. Yeah, okay. Um okay, I can read more. Here it is. I'm not exactly sure. I'm not sure. Goodness. I don't know why I do this. I'm sorry. I'll be right back. I'm just looking for something that I've misplaced. Oh, I found it. Okay, here we go. Sorry. Just a moment. And it says my phone is starting, which is always weird. Because usually when I take it off of the charger, I would think that it would have been on, but I guess not. I don't know. Um, it's been comfortable today. I can tell you that. Like not crazy. Like, I was able to wash my hair and not feel cold. And that was so nice to not feel cold. Like, that's the thing. Like, I love the time of year when you can wash your hair and it just, it's just like not not so hot that you feel like you're going to sweat as your hair is drying, but also not so cold that you feel cold having so much wringing wet hair. Like, I love when it's in this kind of moderate temperature. It's just wonderful. Okay, let me see if I can. Hmm. Okay, I'm looking for it. Apparently, I no longer have. So I used to have this thing over at the bottom of the screen. Okay, well, it says it's 57 Fahrenheit, 57 degrees. I don't feel like that's cold. I feel like that's pretty nice. Well, reading a book about food is something that does make me hungry. Yeah, absolutely. It did concern me at first that it seemed as though it was describing the exact same thing that had happened like two chapters before. And it was like, this is too familiar. And it confused me. And then it turned out to be actually a different chapter. It's just that history repeated itself that fast. And they were dealing with pretty much like the same thing that fast all over again. Mm. um, one moment. I just have to do something really quickly. I have this problem sometimes when I'm trying to use Bing. where it doesn't do things it's supposed to be able to do. Mm. Okay, maybe that's what I'm supposed to do here. Did that work? Okay, good. So I must have changed what you're supposed to do there. You won't believe it, sorry. I'll be right back. It's literally being just being so slow. I'm sorry. What? Maria's gonna come in here and be like arguing with you guys. Chapter 6. Herbert Hoover liked to say that the gourmets of the world should forget Paris and go to Iowa, advice that said more about his politics than his food preferences. Yeah, I feel more energetic now. This is great. As a grown man, Hoover looked back on his Iowa childhood as a kind of Eden on the prairie. Unspoiled countryside populated by sturdy Bible-reading men and women. Set loose to explore the natural world, 10-year-old Bert fished, hunted with a slingshot, and swam in a mud-bottomed pond, but like everyone else on the farm, he worked too. To Hoover's profound approval, self-sufficiency was the farmer's way of life. Whatever the family needed, it produced. Each farm its own soap company, carpet factory, flour mill, and cannery. For Hoover, Iowa farmhouse cooking was a cuisine of self-reliance. The Sunday meals of ham and cornbread, edible testimony to the values he saw as America's bedrock. The barrels and jars of winter provisions put up by farm women every fall were, in Hoover's own words, social security itself. The food that Hoover admired so much in theory was not necessarily the food he chose to eat. In his pre-presidential life as a mining executive, Hoover had crisscrossed the globe, making the rounds of Europe's top eating spots. By the time he returned to the United States, he had developed a worldly appreciation for continental dining, which was also shared by his wife, Lou Henry Hoover. When Hoover was appointed Secretary of Commerce, the couple bought a mansion and immediately began throwing parties. Lou earned a reputation as a charming and generous hostess, while Hoover's cook, Mary Ratley, became famous among the political set for her oyster soufflés and fish with cucumber sauce. As the country's most visible dinner hosts, President and Miss Hoover raised their hospitality standards to levels previously unknown in the White House. Within days of Hoover's taking office, Washington observers declared an end to simple fare at the presidential dinner table. Coolidge was known for his taste for plain food, and the start of a new, more elevated dining era. The change was regarded with some amount of uneasiness. As one White House watcher described it, President Hoover is an eater, a large, discriminating eater. He might even be called, in the milder sense of the word, a gourmet. Dishes with unpronounceable names that the couple had discovered on their travels were introduced to the White House menu, causing anxiety for a kitchen staff unfamiliar with foreign cooking. If the cook was ever at a loss, the head housekeeper would consult with Miss Hoover, who provided the kitchen with detailed cooking instructions. Ingredients used in the Hoover kitchen were often imported or out of season, but they were always the best available. Unsurprisingly, the Hoovers' entertaining costs far exceeded the White House budget. To cover the bill, the Hoovers took the unusual step of making up the difference from their own substantial bank account. The style in which the Hoovers fed their guests confirmed the impression of opulence. A grand affair under any administration, a formal dinner used during the Hoovers' tenure was occasion to unlock the White House treasure chest. The dining room was awash in gold. Running down the center of the table, a gilt-edged mirror purchased by President Monroe was flanked by gold-plated dishes, forks, knives, and spoons. The table was lit by many-branched golden candelabra and decorated with tall golds. I don't know. Ornate bowls filled with luscious fruit. At the inaugural dinner, even Miss Hoover was encased in gold, greeting dignitaries in a gleaming gold brocade gown. At the head of the table, Hoover was like a nervous schoolboy at his own birthday party, the focus of attention but too overwhelmed to join in the festivities, known as abnormally reserved. Hoover was a reluctant politician who hated the glad handing and similar tasks required of his office. At the table, he was far more comfortable as a listener than a talker, his reticence easily interpreted as aloofness. Of course, formality was expected at state dinners, but even when the Hoovers dined alone, their meals were taken in the state dining room, the president attired in a black denim jacket. A row of butlers in tails and white ties stood at attention, all of them the same height, as Miss Hoover insisted, with the exception of the towering head butler, Alonzo Fields. Not even Fields, however, was permitted to speak to the president unless spoken to. When the tables were cleared, the men were under strict orders to prevent the silverware from clinking against the china. To people in the Hoover's orbit, particularly those who worked in the White House, the rigid etiquette seemed to confirm the president's remoteness, which was ironic for a man known as the Great Humanitarian. More forgiving observers, however, said that Hoover was just as compassionate as before, only now the real Herbert Hoover was hidden behind a front of presidential dignity. As his term progressed and the economy continued to unravel, the first couple's lavish entertainments added to the perception that the president was out of touch with the travails of average Americans during a time of national crisis. He considered scaling back, but on reflection decided against it. Casting himself in the role of unflinching leader, he resolved to carry on as part of his business as usual policy. Attitude was key. In Hoover's analysis, the panic on Wall Street had prompted consumer hysteria that in turn had hurt American manufacturers, causing further panic, and so on in an ever-ending loop. As a head of state, Hoover felt it was his job to break the cycle of anxiety by projecting a confident demeanor. At the same time, Hoover was opposed to any program that could undermine what he saw as the core American values of individualism, self-help, and local volunteerism. On the grounds that greater government involvement would endanger the American spirit of charity, something infinitely valuable in Hoover's judgment, his main vehicle for helping the unemployed offered them nothing more concrete than the government enthusiasm. Founded in October 1931, the President's Emergency Committee for Employment obeyed the central tenet that help for the unemployed was a local responsibility. As a result, PECE devoted itself to the coordination and mobilization of local relief efforts. Its success is trumpeted by a vigorous public relations machine. Devoted itself to the coordination. Okay. In his past life as a relief administrator, Hoover had never been afraid to jump on a train and travel to the heart of a crisis. True, the sight of human suffering had always rattled him, particularly the suffering of children, but at no time had that stopped him from getting close enough to any disaster to make first-hand appraisal. During his presidency, however, Hoover steered clear of the breadlines and employment bureaus. He never toured Appalachia or Mississippi or interviewed one of the newly unemployed. Bizarrely, the investigative instincts that had served him so well as an administrator seemed to elude him as president. In the place of making on-the-scene assessments for information on the job list, he turned to PECE members, visiting businessmen and allied politicians, almost all of them Republican. Based largely on their reporting, the president decided that Americans needed to step up their own attempts at charity, one neighbor helping the next. The government can't do all of it, he explained to reporters, and besides, he added, nobody is actually starving. A claim often repeated by Hoover and his supporters, no one has starved, became the fallback response to all those purveyors of gloom hawking their grim statistics and dire predictions. Proof that a government dole was still unnecessary, it also justified Hoover's refusal to grant federal relief. Nevertheless, Hoover's optimism was belied by reports that began to appear in newspapers across the country. In Toledo, Ohio, a young mother walked into a diner holding her 2-year-old son. Just some milk and cereal for the baby, she told the waiter with a greasy apron. That will be a dime, won't it? I'm not hungry. After the child had eaten, she picked the last dime from her shabby purse, walked out into the wintry night, and collapsed. The woman survived, but others, it appeared, were too far gone. In Hartford, a 37-year-old work dodger was discovered unconscious. The man was promptly taken to a hospital where doctors tried to revive him, but his resistance was too greatly undermined by lack of nourishment. In New Orleans, a 76-year-old man collapsed in a soup kitchen. His last words were, "I never asked anyone for help." His death certificate read, "Heart attack, but welfare workers said he died of starvation." Faced with growing evidence of health crisis across the United States, Hoover asked the Surgeon General to prepare a report comparing sickness and mortality in the first 5 months of both 1928 and 1931. The president could not have hoped for better news. According to the country's chief doctor, the economic crisis seemed to have had no adverse effects on America's health. Both tuberculosis deaths and infant mortality had actually dropped, and influenza rates were unusually low. The report gave Hoover permission to follow his conscience. That October, in place of a federal relief program, Hoover founded the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief, a committee of businessmen led by Walter Gifford, president of AT&T, which was assigned to raise money for local charities. Maybe that's not the same AT&T. It says AT&T like the like the phone. That can't be right. Unless it is. I'm so confused. Which was assigned to raise money for local charities, using every form of media at its disposal. POUR, that's POUR, began a massive fundraising campaign through advertisements in newspapers and magazines, on radio and city billboards. POUR appealed to the public's sense of civic responsibility with slogans like, "I will share, and of course we can do it." The American public, however, was unswayed. A man who liked to keep his fingertips on the numbers, Hoover could see that the drives were earning diminishing returns. Conservative allies nevertheless assured him that funds were sufficient to help the unemployed through the winter. Hoover listened to his advisors and, ignoring the numbers, stayed on course with his no-relief policy into the election year of 1932. Earlier that year, the starvation question seemed to receive a definitive answer. Its source was the chief statistician. I'm sorry. Oh my goodness. I'm sorry. I'll try that again. Statistician. I don't know why that just feels so weird. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company. In January, after tabulating the company's mortality records, Dr. Lewis Dublin discovered that the nation was in excellent health. In spite of the depression, the basic needs of policyholders for food, clothing, and shelter had been well met. What's more, the weight loss program imposed by the depression may have been exactly what the country needed. As a people, Dublin explained, we are given normally to overfeeding, and this has led to much trouble, as every physician knows. I would not be surprised if, under the present conditions of enforced moderation, many have enjoyed better health than ever before. With regard to starvation, the doctor was unambiguous. Dublin had found no evidence at all that anybody in these United States is starving. News that should hearten worried Americans. Dublin's no starvation announcement appeared in an article that had written for the social work magazine Better Times. Where the man on the street may have taken the doctor at his word, the welfare professionals who were the publication's main readers had seen enough of the depression to question the accuracy of his assertion. Aware of the controversy, the editors of Better Times offered its readers this challenge. Is Dr. Dublin right? Is there no evidence of starvation? Better Times invites those who have the evidence to cite it. The answer came in an article published that April. According to hospital records, in 1931, 95 people in New York City had been diagnosed with starvation, and of course 20 had died from lack of food. And this was aside from the more widespread problem of malnutrition, slow physical decline brought on by insufficient foods that so often ended in premature death. Articles like this one helped inform a debate when taking place in Washington. Despite Hoover's no-relief policy, congressional Democrats and progressive Republicans, convinced of the need for federal relief, introduced bills in both the House and Senate to give as much as $250 million to help the unemployed. Hearings for the bills included testimony from a long line of social workers, labor leaders, unemployed miners, and so on, all bearing witness to the dire conditions in Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, Appalachia, and Mississippi cotton country. In case anyone believes these were merely localized conditions, socialist journalist Oscar Ameringer recounted his recent experiences on a cross-country journey. In the state of Washington, I was told that the forest fires raging in that region all summer and fall were caused by unemployment timber workers and bankrupt farmers in an endeavor to earn a few honest dollars as firefighters. The last thing I saw on the night I left Seattle was numbers of women searching for scraps of food in the refuse piles of the principal market of that city. A number of Montana citizens told me of thousands of bushels of wheat left in the fields uncut on account of its low price that hardly paid for harvesting. In Oregon, I saw thousands of bushels of apples rotting in the orchards. Only absolutely flawless apples were still saleable at from 40 to 50 cents a box containing 200 apples. At the same time, there are millions of children who, on account of their parents, will not eat one apple this winter. I talked to one man in a restaurant in Chicago. He told me of his experience in raising sheep. He said that he has killed 3,000 sheep this fall and thrown them down the canyon because it had cost $1.10 to ship a sheep, and then he would get less than $1 for it. He said he could not afford to feed the sheep, and he would not let them starve, so he just cut their throats and threw them down the canyon. The roads of the West and Southwest teem with hungry hitchhikers. The campfires of the homeless are seen along every railroad track. I saw men, women, and children walking over the hard roads. Most of them were tenant farmers who had lost their all in the late slump in wheat and cotton. Between Clarksville and Russellville Ark, I picked up a family. The woman was hugging a dead chicken under a ragged coat. When I asked her where she had procured the fowl, first she told me she had found it dead in the road, and then added in grim humor, "They promised me a chicken in the pot, and now I got mine." Despite accounts like Emmeringer's, when relief measures came to a vote, they were blocked by a coalition of conservative Democrats and Republicans. By early springs of 1932, however, doubts were beginning to creep into the minds of Hoover's political backers. Facing intense pressure, the president decided that relief for the unemployed had become unavoidable, though he needed to find some method of giving it that preserved his conservative principles. Above all, the federal government could give no support in the form of money. Hoover and his allies found the perfect alternative in the Federal Farm Board. Founded by Hoover in 1929 to support agricultural prices, the board had purchased millions of bushels of wheat in a failing effort to help wheat farmers. Now the slowly moldering grain was being stored in silos across the Midwest. In a plan devised by the Red Cross and wheat state politicians, the board donated the grain to the Red Cross, which then shipped it to mills across the Great Plains. The resulting white flour was packed into 24-pound sacks with the following inscription: "Bleached, 24 pounds, milled from government-owned wheat by authority of Act of Congress, flour distributed by the American Red Cross, not to be sold." Beginning in March 1932, local government and private charity agencies across the country were encouraged to apply for shipments of Red Cross flour. Aid workers in Los Angeles estimated that they would need 25 railroad cars of flour per month to feed the city's hungry. After the first 6 carloads arrived in early April, the flour was offloaded by a team of unemployed workers and distributed to local welfare agencies, the Salvation Army and the YWCA. A portion was taken by the city's Parent-Teacher Association to be used in its free lunch program. To make the most of government flour, many schools changed their menu plans, using less store-bought bread and replacing it with meat pies and hot biscuits. The Red Cross expected that families given government flour would use it to make bread. They were surprised to discover that large numbers of the American homemakers had forgotten how to bake. To help fill the knowledge gap, the Red Cross distributed pamphlets with simple recipes for baking powder biscuits, kneaded biscuits, muffins, gingerbread, oatmeal, and drop cookies. Some communities opened their own bakeries, where they trained unemployed workers in bread baking skills. Down south, however, flour distribution led to familiar claims of discrimination, as whites received flour with no questions asked, but blacks were required to work on road repair projects before they were considered worthy. The Red Cross chose not to investigate. Still, by July 1932, it had distributed more than 30 million bushels of wheat to millions of unemployed Americans in more than 75% of the country's counties. Hoover and the Red Cross touted the success of the program, but as observers pointed out, those impressive numbers were actually an illustration of the breadth and the depth of the economic crisis. The relief debates in Washington were driven by concern for the unemployed. Behind that concern, however, lurked fear of what the growing numbers of jobless and hungry Americans might do if the situation continued. How long would they tolerate empty stomachs before they were driven to act? In the hills of Kentucky, coal miners told reporters they would steal before hearing their children cry for bread. After a riot over relief in Chicago, a pastor explained, "I can't tell a hungry man to be patient." In a coal district of Oklahoma, 300 gaunt miners and their families marched into the town of Henrietta. After a brief prayer, they stormed local grocery stores, demanded food. The merchants meekly acquiesced. In Washington, testifying before yet another committee, Edward McGrady of the American Federation of Labor told senators that if nothing was done and starvation continued, the doors of revolution are going to be thrown wide open. In fact, in a number of industrial cities, communists had already provoked uprisings when all the protesters really wanted was bread. Actually, as McGrady and the senators well knew, communists were behind some of the largest protest movements in cities from Boston to Los Angeles. In Moscow, Soviet leaders had read the onset of the Great Depression as a sign that the worldwide capitalist system had entered its final collapse. Determined to push it over the edge, in 1931 they instructed the Communist Party of the USA to organize a series of urban hunger marches. Led by the Unemployed Councils, a group organized by the CPUSA to guide the struggles of unemployed workers, the marchers listened to communist orators and carried banners decorated with slogans like "Don't Starve, Fight." The marches generally culminated at City Hall, where demonstrators demanded to meet with the mayor. When a cordon of police denied them entry, protests often turned bloody, with officers wading into the crowd with nightsticks, while protesters entered with fists and bricks. Afterward, both sides could claim success. The police jailed a good number of violent Reds, while the communists earned front-page stories. The success of these local demonstrations led to the organization of the National Hunger March at the end of 1931, when delegations from around the country converged on Washington. Despite predictions of widespread violence, the march ended quietly as Washington's police chief, Pelham Glassford, negotiated the marchers' peaceful entry into the Capitol and allowed them to present their petitions to Congress. 3 months later, in Detroit, one of the country's most economically troubled cities, another hunger march ended in tragedy. Following a sharp drop in auto sales, Henry Ford had fired thousands of his Detroit area workers. At the same time, he refused to donate any of the local relief organizations who were helping feed and house his ex-employees. To protest and to try to squeeze some money out of Henry Ford, the Unemployed Councils organized a hunger march on March 7, 1932, the same day that Hoover signed the wheat distribution bill, from Detroit to Ford's River Rouge plant in nearby Dearborn. At the Dearborn city line, the marchers, a mix of laid-off Ford workers and the young communists, were met by hundreds of Dearborn policemen and Ford security guards, all of them armed. When the marchers refused in order to stop, a shot was fired from the Dearborn side, a start of the running battle in which 4 protesters were killed and 50 more were injured. The injured were later manacled to their hospital beds and placed under arrest. While Ford blamed the violence on the city of Detroit for allowing the march to take place, local newspapers accused the Dearborn police of using their guns on unarmed citizens. In Washington, it was possible to excuse the violence because it involved communists, enemies worthy of the most extreme response. However, President Hoover and the Republicans would soon find themselves facing the challenge of a far greater march right in their own backyard. In 1930, a man named Walter Waters lost his job as an assistant superintendent of a cannery near Portland, Oregon. A veteran of the Great War, Walters had returned 11 years earlier from Europe to be greeted by parades and homecoming banquets. After his discharge from service, however, he found work elusive, bouncing from job to low-paying job in his native Idaho. Fed up, one day he hitchhiked to Washington State, got a job as a harvest hand, and started a new life. He soon married and moved to Portland, where the couple had 2 children. He found a job in the cannery and slowly worked his way up to better paying positions. When he lost his job, the family turned its savings, and Walker hit the streets, looking for work. When the money ran out, the family's personal belongings, one by one, found their way to the pawn shop until they had nothing left but a few clothes. The family survived thanks to the patience of the landlord, a veteran himself, the charity of neighbors, and food relief in the city. As he traveled around Portland, Waters ran into many men in the same position. Years later, when he wrote his autobiography, he recorded his impression of those fellow job hunters, men in threadbare clothing pacing the sidewalk in shoeless shoes. On their faces the same look, part of hope, part of bewilderment, as they searched for a chance to earn a few dollars of honest work. Many of them were down on their luck veterans like himself. They had fought, so they had been told a few years before, to save the nation. They had fought, it now seemed, and only in order to have a place in which to starve. As they waited in employment offices, in relief lines, and along the city's Skid Row, their conversations often turned to the questions of the bonus for World War I veterans. In 1924, Congress had voted over Coolidge's veto for the World War Adjusted Compensation Act, which was meant to make up the difference between a soldier's pay during wartime and what he would have made in civilian life. The maximum a veteran could hope to receive was $625. The catch, however, was that this bonus was not scheduled to be paid until 1945. For men hunkered down in the trenches of the Great Depression, that seemed a long time to wait. $600 could make a huge difference to the life of a hungry and jobless veteran. Some Democratic politicians agreed. Since 1929, Congressman Wright Patman of Texas had campaigned for a bill to amend the Compensation Act to pay out the houses immediately. By early 1932, it looked like the bill might finally come up for a vote against the strenuous opposition of the president amongst all Republicans and even many Democrats, including Governor Roosevelt. Portland's Veterans Association asked all its members to sign petitions and write to politicians to help secure the vote. Walter Waters was a little more canny about the ways of Washington. Our only hope was in following the successful tactics of big business. When its representatives wanted something from Congress, they went to it personally and said so. He stood up in veterans' meetings and suggested that Portland veterans send him a delegation to Washington to directly lobby senators and congressmen. Initially, the men were unconvinced and trusted their government to do the right thing, but in Washington, politicians from both parties saw the bonus bill as a license to print money without the backing of gold bond issues. On May 6, 1932, the House Ways and Means Committee voted to permanently shelve the bonus bill. 4 days later, Portland's veterans agreed to send a delegation of 250 men under strict military discipline to the nation's capital. That same day, they headed down the rail yards to embark on their journey across the United States. As with all armies, the first and ongoing challenge of the bonus army was to secure provisions. The men arrived at the yards with no food and only a few dollars between them, hoping to catch a freight train heading east. While most of the troops slept in empty freight cars for the night, Walters and some of his comrades were scavenging it and found a few greasy spoons that were still open. The owners were sympathetic to their cause and willing to donate coffee and bread. By jumping freights, caging rides on trucks, and foraging for food, the men gradually made their way across the country, taking 10 days to reach St. Louis. When they entered the new town, the marchers often staged impromptu parades, passing the hat to onlookers to raise money for the next leg of their journey. In East St. Louis, Illinois, however, they hit a roadblock at the Baltimore and Ohio freight yards. Railway officials refused to let men board empty eastbound freight cars. In response, the Oregon veterans blocked the tracks, bringing one of the nation's most important freight lines to a standstill. The police were the first on the scene, followed by reporters when the governor called in 6 companies of the Illinois National Guard. The bonus marchers became national news. Finally, the local sheriff rounded up a fleet of trucks to ship the men east. Let them be another sheriff's problem, not his. Meanwhile, in Texas, Florida, Maine, Michigan, California, and dozens of other states, thousands of veterans suffering through hard times had read about the Oregon marchers, and they too hit the road for the nation's capital. By May 29, when Walter Waters and his men finally made it to Washington, more contingents were on their way, some as large as 1,500 men, with a few wives and children in tow as well. Washington's police chief, Pelham Glassford, had done his best to keep the protesters from entering the city, but now that they were there, he felt he had no choice but to help them find food and a place to stay. Most were sent to camp at the far side of the Anacostia River, with a view of the Capitol building just over the trees. The site was little more than a tidal flat that had turned to mud when it rained and stank from the sewage of the river. Others found makeshift lodgings in buildings slated for demolition nearer the Capitol. As one reporter described them, the men were visibly at the end of their ropes, close enough to starvation to know what it means for themselves and their families. I have to look something up. This has brought something else to my mind I just have to know. The veterans' camp became something of a local spectacle. Many of the Washingtonians who came to view it were sympathetic to the veterans' cause. Among them was the wealthy socialite Evelyn Walsh McLean, owner of the Hope Diamond, and estranged wife of the owner of the Washington Post. Late one night, Miss McLean found Glassford, and the pair drove to a nearby Child's restaurant. Miss McLean brought 1,000 sandwiches and 1,000 packs of cigarettes, while Glassford paid out of his own pocket for 1,000 cups of coffee. All of which became breakfast for the bonus marchers. Glassford also rounded up donations of 4 150-pound turtles to make into turtle stew and 1,500 pounds of pork from the Dixie Barbecue Company. He called up the National Guard barracks and found a half-dozen U.S. Army rolling kitchens that the veterans could use to cook their meals. Meanwhile, the marchers began to construct a makeshift rag and tin can city on the Anacostia Flats, scavenging lumber, furniture, old cars, and anything else that could be used as shelter. Let me just look something up briefly. I'm so curious. Oh, oh, it is. Okay. I was just curious. It is. Huh. Yeah, it was just sounded so familiar to me. I was like, I've seen a movie like that. That's just. Let me just. I don't want to say it out loud. I'll just say it here. I mean, it's fictitious, but that's. I was like, that reminds me of that movie. Huh. How weird. Okay. Hunger marchers preparing food on a mobile stove, Washington, D.C. It's a crazy movie, but it's like I didn't realize it was set during that time. Like the thing, like, don't they do something like that at one point? The, like, jumping on trains? How are you? Is it is it snowy where you are? I know you're up north. We had snow for like a week. Not for a week, I'm sorry, I didn't mean for a week. It might not have been a whole week. Um, it was like ice, maybe a few days. But it was like, it would melt a little bit, and then at night it would freeze up again. Um, but yeah. Anyway, I don't know why. Just like suddenly reading that made me think of that movie. Anyway, let me go on. Um, During the first weeks of the bonus army's encampment, Chief Glassford tried to find some organization that would help feed the veterans, but the city government and various veterans groups refused. He went to the Red Cross, but it agreed to donate only a small amount of flour and no milk for the camp's children. Glassford had better look with local sports fans, who organized a professional boxing match that raised $2,700 to buy supplies. Finally, however, he had to give primary responsibility for feeding the men, now now numbering roughly 20,000, to Walter Waters and the other bonus army leaders. The feeding system they organized was along the lines of the U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps. The men were fed twice a day, early in the morning and again around 4 or 5 p.m. For Waters, finding supplies was a constant challenge. We managed during the entire time to furnish bread and coffee as a minimum, and never once failed. The rest of the menu varied from turtle soup to boiled grits. Only by the narrowest margin, on 1 or 2 days in July, was sufficient food secured to prevent a foodless day. Never was there food in plenty. "This camp ought to be called 'No Seconds,'" was a remark that sums up the entire food situation. One day there would have been no firsts if a manufacturer in New York had not supplied 1,500 pounds of meat that was sent down by airplane. Instead of army mess kits, for plates the veterans used old newspapers. On good days, the main dish was slumgullion. A term originally coined during the California Gold Rush days to describe the watery mixture of mud and gravel left over from the mining process. During the war, it became slang for Army beef stew. Serving 100 soldiers, the Army recipe called for 25 pounds of beef and 20 pounds of potatoes, both cubed and then stewed, with 4 pounds of onions, the broth thickened with a pound of flour. The men were unanimous in praising it as better than anything they had received in the bread line, slopping it up with bread from Ottenberg's, a local Jewish bakery. During the first weeks of their Washington stay, the majority of veterans spent their days in camp playing cards, singing army songs, and composing ditties. Mellon pulled the whistle, Hoover rang the bell, Wall Street gave the signal, and the country went to HELL. While the men bided their time, their leaders pressed the case for early payment of the bonus with senators, congressmen, and vice president, and any other politician who would listen, and many did. One who did not was Hoover, determined that no ragtag group of protesters, even those who had served their country, would disrupt the dignity of his office. The president refused to engage with them. Moreover, he was increasingly convinced that the bonus army was actually a communist-instigated movement. There were certainly communists among the veterans, but they were a minority and were kept isolated by bonus army leaders. In any case, Hoover had a campaign to run and was either busy preparing for the Republican convention or on weekends resting in his camp in the Virginia mountains. In the absence of clear leadership from the White House, the situation outside its gates deteriorated as the summer progressed. The food supply for the bonus army was running low, and the children living in the camps showed signs of malnutrition. After Congress adjourned in mid July, the army turned its attentions on the president, who steadfastly. The battery is dead. That's okay. I can start charging the battery right now. That's okay. I forget though sometimes. Isn't there one that's actually better suited for this? Those two. Okay, that's not it. I'll just use this. I know it works. It's okay. There we go. Ow! Oh my goodness. I just cracked my jaw. I didn't mean to. Um, I'm letting it charge right now. Mm. Mm. Mm, let's see, where was it? In the absence of clear leadership from the White House, the situation outside its gates deteriorated as the summer progressed. The food supply for the bonus army was running low, and children living in the camps showed signs of malnutrition. After Congress adjourned in mid July, the Army turned its attention to the President, who steadfastly refused a meeting. After weeks of noisy pickets and a few attempts by veterans to sneak into the White House, Hoover and the city commissioners decided they had enough of the bonus marchers. On July 21st, Waters was told that they must leave the downtown buildings where some had camped, return the Army's rolling kitchens, and be out of Anacostia Flats by August 4th. The veterans wanted to stay put, they had nowhere else to go, and planned to find a permanent encampment on private land. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army's Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur, was convinced that the protesters were insurgents bent on revolution and had begun to quietly move tanks and other weapons into the city. Waters thought he could get an extension, but on July 28 his men received word that they must immediately evacuate downtown buildings. As the police watched, the men fled out peacefully, until a sudden scuffle broke out. A policeman panicked and shot two veterans, killing one and mortally wounding the other. On word of the shootings, Hoover decided that Glassford had lost control of the situation and ordered the U.S. Army to clear the veterans from downtown Washington. General MacArthur leaped at the invitation. Under his command, 200 saber-wielding cavalrymen, 5 tanks, and trucks of infantrymen with bayonets rolled down the Pennsylvania Avenue. As crowds gathered to watch, when soldiers reached the camp, they were met by rocks and hurled tear gas bombs in return. As clouds of tear gas engulfed the spectators, soldiers chased the veterans from the row of abandoned buildings that had been their temporary home. The men fled toward Anacostia, followed by U.S. Army troops. At this point, General MacArthur unilaterally decided that his job was to expel the bonus army from Washington. When the soldiers paused at the Anacostia Bridge, a messenger caught up to MacArthur with word from the president. The soldiers must not evict the veterans, now numbering 7,000 men, women, and children from Anacostia. Shortly after the messenger left, the general ordered his men to storm the camp. Under the glare of spotlights, soldiers marched across the bridge and into the jumble of improvised shelters, tossing more tear gas bombs and setting shacks ablaze. Veterans and their families grabbed their belongings and ran. Anacostia was soon in flames, the vast orange glow visible from the White House. In the aftermath of the July 28 rout from Washington, editorial pages around the country showed their support for Hoover's handling of the bonus army, blaming the violence on the communists, the Democratic politicians who lured the veterans to Washington with false hopes, and the veterans themselves. Back in New York, however, Governor Roosevelt saw the burning of Anacostia as an instance of political suicide. Sitting up in his bed on the following morning, the New York Times opened in front of him. Roosevelt told an aide, "There is no need to drag Anacostia into the campaign. The reporters had done it for them." Why didn't Hoover offer the men coffee and sandwiches instead of turning Doug MacArthur loose? As Americans read the newspaper articles and watched newsreel footage of the U.S. Army bearing down on poor defenseless veterans, public sentiment began to peel away from the president. His treatment of the bonus army became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the country, a sentiment encapsulated by the E.Y. Yip Harburg song, "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? By the time the bonus army left Washington, the presidential campaign of 1932 had slightly more than 3 months left. Fixated on the principle that each man is his brother's keeper, Hoover was unwavering on the subject of relief. In a major speech, he promised that no man, woman, or child should go hungry or unsheltered through the coming winter, insisting that local charities could manage the job. Roosevelt's 1932 platform was not all that different. Like the president, he would work for balanced budgets and was against the veterans' bonus. On the subject of federal relief, however, the two men diverged. Back in April, Roosevelt had given his famous Forgotten Man speech, accusing the current administration of worrying too much about propping up the banks, railroads, and corporations at the top of the economic pyramid while ignoring the people below. Roosevelt's critics often rightly accused the governor of speaking glittering generalities. A week before the election, however, he gave a speech that clearly expressed his vision of the federal government's role in relief. This nation owes a positive duty that no one shall be permitted to starve. This means that while the immediate responsibility for relief rests with local, public, and private charity, insofar as these are inadequate, the states must carry the burden, and whenever states are unable adequately to do so, the federal government owes the positive duty of stepping into the breach. The aura of presidential dignity that Hoover had worked so hard to cultivate now eluded him. On the campaign trail, he looked drawn, tired, and bereft of ideas, while Roosevelt exuded optimism. While the American people went to the polls on November 8, 1932, they overwhelmingly voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt as their next president. Okay. So I'd say that's about 40 pages we've read today so far. About 40. About 40 pages. Um, since it is charging though, and I don't actually want to mess up with charging, I could just go ahead and let this charge and then come back and do some more reading when it's finished charging. If that's alright. Goodbye for now. Thank you for listening. Bye.